While the university is commonly understood to be a place where different knowledge systems enter into dialogue and debate, the institutional structures of the university tend to acculturate and conscript different kinds of knowledge into their own existing categories for what can be known, how knowledge can be organized, and what forms of knowledge are legitimate and credible. The Different Knowing speaker series and interviews address the question of if and how the university can be a place of different knowings, different epistemologies, different knowledges.
I think no English department in the US, and I'm going to guess in Canada, is really set up to train people to do Indigenous studies, even Indigenous literary studies. And I think what's missing is this interconnectedness. What we need to know, if we really wanted to think about Indigenous literatures, we need to know things about architecture, Indigenous architecture. We need to know things about all the other arts, because we have these really developed aesthetic systems for which they're not only beautiful examples of accomplishment, beautiful baskets, beautiful textiles, beautiful pottery, beautiful carving, there's also a highly developed intellectual tradition around all of those art systems about what makes something beautiful, what makes it powerful, what makes it effective. And that has largely not informed how we think about this relatively new art form of alphabetic writing, that we might somehow draw on this rich system. When you start looking at like art history and anthropology and other texts where people have tried to investigate how was it that people decided this is a beautiful textile and this one isn't such a good one, right? Really this rich understanding, right, of the makers and of the audience at the time. That's also a fundamental problem with most English studies, with the assumption that the audience is always white and middle class, right? No matter what the text is, the sort of governing assumption seems to be that that's the only audience. And even something as simple as, well, what if we reimagine the audience as including Native people themselves, including Native people who are highly knowledgeable about Native culture? How would that change our reading, right? So I don't know that English departments are set up right now. I think there's less of a worry about somehow violating other knowledge systems because we're so bad in English departments at getting anywhere near them, right? I think that's less of the concern right now. I take the tack that anything that's been published and meant to be in the public domain, so Alison Hedgecote published her book intending it to circulate widely, that feels to me that that's fair game for really doing an investigation of. I would not feel the same way about a sacred text, an oral narrative, something from a community where it was not intended, had not been broadcast, right, intentionally. But if we were to think about what would we need to know to read something like Blood Run Well, it's not coming from the English department. And that's really where the interdisciplinary aspect is really key if we think about training. And I think especially for graduate level training, if we were going to design from the bottom up Indigenous literary studies, I would want that to have mandatory art history, mandatory go over the dance department, mandatory learning about other type of artistic traditions and their aesthetic systems to inform the way.
And specifically Indigenous aesthetics in those various areas?
I think so. I think it would not be as simple, though, as exclusively. And anything that's contemporary, I think, is drawing from multiple traditions. Bill Reed, the Haida carver, who did such amazing work, wrote some really interesting things about how we know and can know great artwork of the past. And he's thinking particularly Haida and other Northwest Coast pieces. But he had a very, I think, expansive understanding that all kinds of art knowing, right, informs, right, our interpretation and appreciation. And so it wouldn't be to take, and I agree with him, it wouldn't be to take a narrow, we should only know these things, but to take an expansive view. And especially then to think about how any work of art, any work of literature circulates. And so it's interesting to think about older texts that may have circulated in a smaller realm originally, and then how they move maybe in a more expansive way now. But when we think about contemporary work, something like Blood Run, is written and published to be disseminated widely. And Hedgecock intends for that to have a local activist impact. She's trying in a very concrete way to get the state of South Dakota to protect more of that land. It's a very clear activist agenda. It's not like we sometimes talk in literary studies that the text has some sort of vague activist agenda. This is a really specific, what people are on the ground typically are doing is other kinds of writing that is more immediately necessary for their communities, or smaller forms like poetry and drama that don't require the kind of leisure time that writing the novel typically requires. But activist texts, things that are designed to be part of activism, so manifestos and declarations, right? Those kinds of texts that are meant to circulate either to rally the local community or to respond to the dominant community or to incite, right, action, often do really similar kinds of things that what we think of literature is supposed to do in terms of representing a community, holding up its symbols or creating its symbols, and thinking across, right, different kinds of communities, creating a discourse between communities. And I think part of it is just acknowledging the large body of writing there is in indigenous communities in lots of places when we look at everything that people were producing and not the limited categories that we tend to look at in the standard English literature curriculum.